So thank you very much for your patience and endurance. I see that you're still very much alive, seeing how much questions that you have answered and asked to Florian. I'm very delighted to be here. It's been some fascinating 2 days that I've spent with you. And just give me this. Let me get this in the right form. All right. And what I want to do here is, coming from law, I have been coming to Spencer Brown through system theory, and it's quite established in law that you use system theory, and it's rather unestablished that you refer directly to Spencer Brown, and I've been rather surprised by this fact, given that the very name of his book is Laws of Form. So there must be something that could be comparable, I don't know. And with my young foolishness, maybe, I've chosen the title of Normativity Reconsidered, because I thought that reading Spencer Brown could help me understand better what it is actually that law is doing. And what law is doing to society, I named this normativity. The definition from systems theory would be that normativity would be something that, despite being not satisfied every time, it still upholds. So let me give you an example. You know that by crossing the street, there might be a car run into you, but a normative expectation about the situation would be that this does not happen, in fact. So, here, yeah, all right. So another reason why I'm coming to law is, I'm coming to laws of form, is also the sensation that I share with Hamlet, that the time is somewhat out of joint. Something is changing, and we need to bring in a different perspective and try to find different ways of dealing with the problem. But very much like Hamlet, I also have cursed the situation that I've brought myself in. Actually, why? But since I've started working with Spencer Brown about a year ago, and I must say that it has worked me also very hard, actually. But the sensation that I get is that through the abstract level that the laws of form provide us, we can take a different look at inherited meaning that I find as a scholar of law, and bring in a totally different perspective. And the idea would be that the very basic operation that every lawyer is doing, that happens in law, is of course also is drawing a distinction. Every time a lawyer operates, he's drawing a distinction. Probably to start with the first part, this is commented by Heinz von Förster in his review of the laws of form. Maybe some of the hesitations for a lawyer to approach the laws of form is its mathematical language, and mathematics are more associated with a description, while law is more something that is prescribing how a situation should be. And so I find it rather encouraging that Heinz von Förster has observed that this is actually a misconception, as laws are not the laws of form, as Spencer Brown has presented us. They are not mere description, they're actually commands. So they share a lot with law itself. So the idea would be that with the laws of form, we can approach the legal paradox that every lawyer is confronted with. And in the abstract formulation, this would be the code that a lawyer is applying to any situation that is given to him would be to say whether it's legal or illegal. And the question that this implies, of course, but that he cannot answer, is whether this is legal or illegal to apply this code. This is the basic paradox I see in law. And I've written this in Sollen and Sein because I don't find similar easy English translation to this, but the kind of the perspective that the lawyer takes upon the world is there is something that is presented to me as it is, but then there is something that how it should it be. So this is maybe a different description of the legal code. And there has been basically two strategies of how to unfold this paradox. The first would be the approach by systems theory by Niklas Luhmann, who just say, okay, there is a paradox, but this paradox is kind of a blockation of the situation. The system cannot operate with upholding the paradox. This paradox has to be unblocked. It has to be unfolded. I think it's quite a good illustration, this citation that I have taken from Luhmann out of his introduction to systems theory, where he says that paradoxical formulation in itself doesn't give you much if you cannot transform it into something else. And the idea would be that what happens in law very much would be that either you find an infinite regress to higher norms every time. So from you have ordinances given by government, and then you have laws enacted by parliament, and then in many countries you find the constitution above that, and then maybe above constitution you find some international law, and this can go on and can go on. You could also simply rupture the process, but this would basically destroy. Or you can kind of find circularity, which is something that's happening quite a lot in laws as well. When you in law books you have cross-references to laws, and you don't really know which law is regulating what part and so on. But basically the idea here would be that implicitly, by unfolding one paradox situation that is presented by one distinction that you draw, you would implicitly draw another distinction where you don't operate with this two-side opposition. And then I found that there is a different conception possible. There is the idea that is presented to us by Jacques Derrida, which is much more embracing the idea of a paradox, where the paradox is not something that is a blockation for the situation, but it's actually the very reason the whole dynamics are being set off. And he has analyzed this in his later life of work, where he's trying to incorporate his philosophical ideas from on grammatology, etc., and apply it to social systems, if you want to, very much like Luhmann has himself, where you analyze first political system, then the law system, and then the economic system. And there he's drawing a distinction of maybe a little bit unfamiliar. For example, the economy is operating because it's very much impossible in the economic system to have a true gift, a gift where there's no counterpart implied. Or in politics, it's operating because of the very impossibility that there could be friendship within the economics, within the political system. And law, on the last step, would be is existing because of the very impossibility of finding a just answer to the distinction legal and illegal. So rather than deferring the problem to somewhere else, maybe to the political system or etc., saying that it's the law has been made by parliament, so the political system, or we are applying this because it's providing us with the most efficient transaction, deferring to the economic system, Derrida tries to transcend this opposition. He doesn't want to unblock it, he doesn't want to unfold it, but he wants to, he sees the system as something that's developing despite this contradiction. And this is what, in other words, that's how he is describing it. But it would imply, in fact, that justice is impossible, because with every act of rendering justice, you would recreate another injustice in the same time, because you cannot embrace the very singularity of every case. You have to alter what is in front of you every time. I find that maybe in Luhmann you can find a different, maybe he's embraced a little bit more of a Derrida approach, because in some of his later works, or in one of his later works, he describes the stoa, the fact of embracing a situation that is very much paradoxical and still going through it, living with the contradictions that there are. So this is maybe something that could be particular to him. And now, because I'm speaking here at the laws of form conference, I find it very helpful to have George Spencer Brown coming in through his re-entry, because the re-entry provides us with a temporal aspect. This is here. the re-entry, he says, is happening. I will speed it up a little. The re-entry is happening in an imaginary state, and that imaginary state is in time. So we have a temporal way of understanding the transcending process here. And I think this implication of time is something that's very efficient, something that's very useful to me as a lawyer, because it implies that from the very beginning you have to embrace an evolutionary perspective. And this evolutionary perspective could allow us to maybe capture what Derrida is saying here in the specters of Marx, that rendering justice would be being absolutely just to the alterity of the other person in front of, to the situation that is in front of you, which of course cannot happen. You cannot embrace every single aspect as it is presenting to you. You have to do some, you have to draw the distinction. And with drawing the distinctions, we are recreating another injustice, as I have said before. And for that, he draws on Heidegger, actually. This is a quotation from Heidegger that is saying, that's not a problem if you, the unjust situation would arise in the moment where you would concede that actually you did not draw a distinction, where you would say, the Fuge, that's the jointure, when you would apply that you did not draw a jointure, that there was no difference that you have recreated. And only in accepting that you are recreating another situation of injustice, you are in fact approaching towards justice in a way. And also in the specters of Marx, we are provided with the rhetorical function that I think helps a little bit to better explain what I want to unfold in front of you, with the entering of a ghost. We have maybe had a ghost approaching us through that door before that, and we have also spoken with Lars yesterday about the Holy Trinity, and implied in that, what he was explaining us there was maybe a third element, a third identity circulating around the situation, and I think this could be described as a ghost. And I find it an excellent formulation of definition of what a ghost actually is. It's the fact of not being able to control where it's going and where it's coming, because it's very much existing by coming back. And this hauntingness, this circularity that this creates between maybe law and society, between maybe also what we have heard in talks before, this engagement with your context, that's what I want to bring into my studies of law. And I think George Spencer Brown has helped me very much with this. And I find further encouragement in Spencer Brown in some of the last, nearly finished, in some of the last words that he has written in the end of the notes to it, where he says, but there is something that's kind of similar to Derridean approach, some difference, that would mean that you cannot really go through the state that you want to, but you can, maybe like an asymptosis, you can get closer to it by saying that the world is itself, but if it wants to describe itself, it needs to draw a distinction, and by that distinction it alters from itself. And I think here, very much in this situation, I can picture this very well with a hauntology that is created there, with kind of a situation where something is always circulating around you, always coming back to you, haunting you, and forces you to observe the situation as between potentiality and actuality, maybe, with what is possible and what is really present, because the ghost really exists in this in-between state of being present and not present. So that's what I had to say with my encounter of George Spencer Brown. Of course, there's lots of questions unanswered, but coming back to this situation, I think it seems very probable, and I like the formulations by George Spencer Brown, because they help me in the imaginary state to combine very different elements of theory that we can find, Luhmann and Derrida in this case, and I think also with his formulations that I've showed you before here in the last situation, I think he's been aware of this very fact. So despite all the megalomania that we have maybe seen in George Spencer Brown, some of it that has been implied by other of the speakers. I think here we see a lot of self-restraint also, with lots of relativization of his own works, and maybe he himself has engaged with the very ghost that he has created. So thank him very much.
Okay, we can take some questions.
Can I ask you something?
One here.
Hi, Jan, thanks very much. I think it can be really fruitful to apply this to law. It's fantastic. I want to put to you, because I'm very strong on this, that Derrida there is a connection between what Derrida is doing and what Spencer Brown's doing. And what's interesting is that he came up with deferred difference or difference around the same time as Spencer Brown came up with re-entry.
Yeah.
But what I think is really important from my point of view with epistemology and ontology is that deferred difference is a skepticism that you can have a stable object of knowledge. And as I was saying another time, because he sees the element of knowledge as the sign, so you never get to the signified in itself. The sign always points, and then there's another definition and another definition in the dictionary as an analogy. Whereas with Spencer Brown, you get to, and this is a Platonic point of view, the distinction. You get to that, and that is the unit of knowledge. That's the thing you know. So in my view, and maybe other people in this room disagree, what Derrida is a skepticism of that other view, the logical semiotic view that that's what knowledge is, which relates to the representational epistemology where you've got noumena and phenomena. And so that's why I strongly object to people bringing in Derrida. So I just want to get some comments.
Let me react to my very limited knowledge of laws of form, but it has been observed that this drawing a distinction itself creates a paradox that you have to resolve.
Yes.
It creates an engagement with the context, if you want to, with the outside of the form. And I think I still insist that, especially because of the formulation that we can find in George Spencer Brown, that maybe he himself has been aware that the calculus has not been, in the presentation that he has found, is the ultimate form of presenting. Otherwise, I guess, a re-entry and the existence of time, the evolutionary perspective, would not be really necessary.
Okay, I'll just quickly say the analogy is very strong. I think I can yell. The analogy is very strong between re-entry and deferred difference, difference.
Yes.
The analogy is very strong. The important thing is Spencer Brown has the distinction as the element of knowledge. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have to jump up into sign signified rolling around.
Right.
And that's what, because Derrida is skeptical that you can have a unit of knowledge because it keeps disappearing, it's beyond you, it's absent in its presence. And so whereas Spencer, this was for me the enlightened moment that Spencer Brown had his unit of knowledge, which is the distinction.
We had a question right here.
Yeah. I was very struck by your this contraposition between justice and law, right, which we live with, right? justice is something it's out of the Platonic heaven, and law is something that we have to do or apply, right? There's one, I come across this fact that laws pile up. There are people building new laws right now continuously. Laws pile up. For instance, in the U.S., there are more laws written since the foundation of the country than people could imagine there ever was. They're getting close to close. Some of them have been unapplied because they've become impossible. They become rules. So the interesting part of law is the dynamics. We always attend to it with the notion it's the law, you can't disobey. But laws come and go, right? And there were people who spent 30 years in jail for smoking marijuana, and in my state, today it is perfectly allowed, and these people are still in jail, which is quite ridiculous. About your model, I think there is some great, some view of what you could do with this, and it's very interesting to contrast these things. But the model should acknowledge that there is a becoming part, which is laws living and dying, laws being suppressed, laws being added, which is human life, and justice on a totally different plateau, right? Yeah. And very often, law isn't just, more often than not, isn't it?
Maybe if I go back to this distinction here, we could say that the laws define what is legal, and they define how the state should be. But and acknowledging that laws have evolved over time does not free the lawyer of an engagement with the situation as it is today. And I think just as is happening here, we can see evolution in the law text. We can see different conceptions of what was right and what was wrong. But justice is happening in the moment when the lawyer tries to translate what is written in the law onto the world, when he's projecting this. And there's a difference in reading the law, the interpretation of the law text, and then its engagement with reality. So I really agree that both of the perspectives are absolutely valid and important to take into account.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I think it shows that, like Kierkegaard writes, that law in the paradoxical sense might be completely opposite to law in the static sense. And what's actually right for you to do in the paradoxical sense becomes something completely other than what's right in the law that happens to be written down. And I think that this dynamic of paradox takes us into quite a different world in a way than when you try and reduce it back down to a knowledge.
Two things. I would like to say it's a dynamic. I don't think
it's a
dynamic. We don't have to say it's a dynamic of paradox. Sometimes there's paradox. And the other thing is that your talk well illustrates the fact that we do not want to say the laws of form.
We'll say laws.
So I have a question for you on this slide. If we take that quote from Spencer Brown, that which is and that which are not are one and the same. I'm not quoting verbatim. Then you have mark over mark, and mark beside. So mark over mark, mark. That's legal with a mark over it, illegal. Which reduces to a mark. Are you saying that's a paradox? Is that what you mean by paradox?
The paradox arises when law engages in observation of the distinction. So probably law is the paradox arises when you try to draw a distinction over this distinction. I guess.
You guess or you know?
I have the feeling.
Ah, good, because that links us to a ground we are travelling through in these presentations, but are not acknowledging, because you've got, I think, should and is.
Yes.
Yeah. And should is a gut feeling. It's an emotion. It's an instinctual thing, and what is or what we know is rational, and we need to integrate both In my language, it's integrating the linear, the story structure, and the dynamic story structure. Could you say something about that?
Let me say that the feeling that I got is that you cannot deal with both sides individually. What you think should be is always corrupted by what you actually find by observing the world, and the vice versa is true too. You look at the world by some preconceived notions at how it should actually present to itself. And the paradox that, what I call paradox, is the obligation that you have to shift your view all the time. And so the distinction that you need to have to draw over this would be probably the re-entry, but a re-entry with engagement of you could go in and out in the same time.
Okay, would you accept that one way of articulating that is that you vibrate so fast that you have the illusion of being stable, but actually you are constantly in motion?
Exactly, that's why with all this, of course, yesterday I was discussing with David Becker, and he was saying me, do you really need George Spencer Brown for all of this? And I think maybe I need him because he's offering me the imaginary state and the time perspective in all this. Because to better capture what is happening in the moment of oscillation, I need time, and then time I describe in the figure of a ghost. So.
Well, to make a bit of a shift, but keeping on this oscillation, in your field of law, Günther Tartner's ideas of hybridity of law and the transformation of law in the 21st century, does that challenge you, or is it a challenge to your continuing regress, or how does this hybridity work in this laws of form, as it is very empirically developed now that the hybridity of transnational law really challenges how we envisage law in time and in the social reality?
So what what I understand with his hybrid forms is that today law is not only made by states, so you have different actors creating law. And I think in this very situation, first that's why I feel the time is out of joint, something is changing very quickly, but it's also why the engagement with this distinction is ever more important to me.
You actually say you feel that time is out of is fuzzy for you, but is time in law fuzzy? So that's a very important distinction. Is it your time that is fuzzy, or is it the time of law that is fuzzy?
Yeah.
Because the crossings are not stable anymore.
Mm-hmm. I would say that it is, law is observing the change and is going through it as well. What I want to do is to be a catalyst for this development by using the laws of form to really capture this change. How's it operating? And what I'm doing with forcing upon law this ghost is to really undig this change. And that forces, as we have seen before, also I like your model of organizations. Maybe it's more concrete, we can better picture what is happening. It forces us to engage with the context. And that's what I want to do. I really want to force law to engage with the society. And Louis
Yeah, and there is some tendency in looking at this formalism to think that resolving the paradox has to do with sustaining an oscillation or going into time in that way.
Yeah.
But there's more than one way to go into time. It could be understood that that going into time means that it's always possible to create something new. It can be understood that there is a wider context. It can be understood that you could go to some imaginary infinity. There are a lot of different points of view, all of which are pointing to the looking for a larger context in which it's unfolded. Mm-hmm. And what looks like a temporal solution may also be simply straight fitting, like this sentence has 33 letters. This doesn't require a recursion because it does have 33 letters if it does. And so one is all, or a Mobius strip, it negates itself, but that's a context which is understood geometrically.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing should be taken in the widest possible creative frame of resolving a problem of law or a problem of paradox into a context in which it can become workable.
All right, I think that is the time that we have.
That's great.
Thank you very much. All right. Up next we have myself.
All right.